The streets of Charleston lay silent beneath the weight of a humid summer night, the gas lamps flickering like dying stars along the cobblestone paths. Behind shuttered windows, the city slept, merchants, planters, and powerful men who believed the world belonged to them. But somewhere in that silence, a lone figure sat awake, the faint glow of a candle painting sharp lines across his determined face. His name was Denmark Vesey, and as the rest of Charleston dreamed, he was planning to shatter their world. What would you risk for freedom? Would you stake your fortune, your future, your very life to break the chains not just for yourself, but for thousands of others? Vesey had once stood on the auction block as property. Now, as a free man, he was ready to gamble everything he had ever gained for the chance to burn slavery to the ground. Before this night was done, his name would either be etched into history as a liberator, or erased forever by the very system he sought to destroy. This is the untold story of a man who dared to plan a revolution while Charleston slept. Denmark Vesey's story did not begin with ambition or dreams. It began in chains. Born around 1767, somewhere on the sun-scorched islands of the Caribbean, his first memories were likely filled with salt air and the hollow clang of iron. As a child, he belonged to the waves and to someone else's ledger. He had no last name then, no freedom to imagine one. His identity was stitched together from pain, survival, and the quiet will to keep breathing when everything around him said he shouldn't. At just 14, he was pulled from the world he knew and loaded onto a slave ship bound for the Americas, a floating coffin of misery and despair. The ship belonged to a wealthy slave trader named Captain Joseph Vesey, a man who made his fortune turning human lives into cargo. The boy was given a number, not a name, and forced into the ship's lower hold with dozens of other captured souls. The stench of sweat, blood, and rot clung to the wooden walls as waves slammed against the hull. Days blurred into nights. Sickness devoured many of them before they ever saw land. He watched bodies that had spoken and laughed only days earlier, wrapped in torn canvas and hurled overboard into the endless sea. But the boy survived. He learned quickly, silently observing, understanding the patterns of his captors. Captain Vesey took notice of him, not as a person, but as something useful. The boy was clever, learned languages fast, and seemed to absorb the details of the world around him. On the decks, he ran messages. In the markets, he translated for buyers. He became valuable. And in a world where value was the only thing that could shield a slave from death, that mattered. After years of serving the captain on voyages between Saint-Domingue, Bermuda, and eventually Charleston, South Carolina, the boy became known by the captain's own name, Denmark Vesey. It wasn't a name given out of affection. It was branding, like the mark burned into cattle. But Denmark accepted it, not because he wanted to belong to the man who owned him, but because names can be sharpened into weapons. Even then, something inside him was watching, planning, waiting. Charleston in the late 1700s was a glittering facade built on horror. Mansions with sweeping verandas lined the streets, carriages rattled past churches with gleaming steeples, and beneath it all lay an economy powered entirely by black bodies in bondage. Enslaved men and women made up the majority of the city's population, yet they were invisible in the eyes of the law. Denmark walked those streets as property, yet his mind was already his own. He saw the contradictions, the polite smiles of white merchants, the quiet weeping in the slave quarters, the brutal whippings that cracked through humid air like gunfire. There were moments when survival meant burying every spark of anger, every trace of defiance. But inside Denmark, that spark never went out. If anything, each humiliation fed it. He watched men rise and fall based on cunning, not just strength. He watched how wealth was built, how power was hoarded, how fear was used like currency. He understood, long before most free men do, that systems are fragile things. They look eternal until someone dares to press on their weak points. This was the harsh reality of his early life. He was owned, and yet he dreamed. He was beaten, and yet he learned. The same world that tried to crush him taught him how to navigate it. Denmark Vesey emerged from the first 2 decades of his life not just alive, but sharpened, keen-eyed, strategic, and quietly ambitious. He had no reason to believe freedom was possible, and yet he began to believe it anyway. For most people, childhood is a place to return to for comfort. For Denmark Vesey, it was something to escape from. That escape would come, eventually, but not as an accident or gift. It would come through calculation, through patience, and through an unwavering belief that his life was worth more than what the world had decided it was. The boy who had been sold, shipped, and branded was becoming a man who would one day set the world on fire. For years, Denmark Vesey had been a shadow drifting through Charleston's bustling markets, always visible yet never seen. He carried goods, ran errands, obeyed orders. But beneath that surface compliance, his mind never stopped working. He memorized prices of cloth and spices, watched the way merchants haggled, noticed how wealth moved quietly from one set of hands to another. He understood the delicate machinery of commerce, how risk could be transformed into opportunity. That knowledge would soon change his life forever. In 1799, fortune finally cracked open the door that the world had tried to seal shut on him. Denmark pulled together a small wager in the East Bay Street Lottery, a risky gamble for any man, but nearly unthinkable for someone enslaved. Yet chance favored him. He won. The prize was $800, a sum so large it seemed almost mythical, especially to a man who owned nothing, not even his own name. In today's money, it would be enough to launch a small business. For Denmark, it became the seed of something even rarer, freedom. He did not waste time. With calm precision, he used $600 of those dollars to purchase his freedom from Captain Vesey, the man who had owned him for decades. Just like that, Denmark Vesey became legally free. The transformation was both instantaneous and agonizingly incomplete. Papers could proclaim him free, but they could not erase the suspicion in white men's eyes or the chains still wrapped around the people he loved. He was free, yet his wife and children remained enslaved. That contradiction carved something deep into him, a sense that personal success meant nothing if it did not ripple outward. Freedom, as Denmark discovered, was not a finish line. It was a new kind of battlefield. As a free black man in Charleston, he had to navigate a city that tolerated his existence but never welcomed it. White authorities watched free blacks with paranoid eyes, fearing they might inspire the enslaved majority to dream beyond their chains. Denmark kept a low profile outwardly, while inwardly sharpening his mind like a blade. He studied scripture, literature, and world events, absorbing stories of revolutions in Haiti and France, stories where ordinary men rose up and remade the world. He began to see freedom not as a fragile gift, but as something that could be engineered, scaled, multiplied. Entrepreneurs know that freedom demands discipline, and Denmark lived that truth. He opened a small carpentry shop and threw himself into his work. His craftsmanship was meticulous, his reputation swift to grow. Soon, wealthy white families hired him to build furniture and repair their elegant homes. He managed contracts, balanced payments, and negotiated prices with the quiet confidence of a man who had finally taken the reins of his own life. He built savings, acquired tools, and even offered work to other black men who sought honest wages. In an economy designed to exclude him, Denmark carved out his own foothold. Yet while he thrived in the daylight, he could never forget the darkness he had escaped. Every day, he walked past auction blocks where children were sold from their mothers. He passed chained work gangs, their backs slick with sweat and scars, watched by men who treated them like beasts of burden. Success had not dulled his memory, it sharpened it. He began quietly setting aside money to try to buy his family's freedom, but the laws and the owners resisted at every turn. The system was designed to hold them, to make sure that even a man as determined as Denmark could not dismantle it alone. Still, he refused to surrender to despair. Instead, he built influence. He joined the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a gathering place for Charleston's free black community, and rose as a respected leader within its walls. He spoke with eloquence, his words carrying the weight of someone who had escaped the impossible. People listened. Men who had once bowed their heads in silence began to raise their eyes when Denmark spoke. To them, he was proof that the impossible might be negotiable after all. This was Denmark Vesey's greatest transformation, not from enslaved to free, but from invisible to undeniable. He had turned a stroke of luck into a platform, and a platform into power. And yet, for all his success, his gaze kept drifting back toward the world he had left behind, the world that still chained millions. He had walked out of the fire, but he could still hear the screams within it. And deep inside, the idea began to grow. What if freedom wasn't something you begged for or bought? What if it was something you took? For years after buying his freedom, Denmark Vesey walked the streets of Charleston as a man caught between two worlds. He was free on paper, yet chained by what he saw every day. He watched as men in tailored coats strolled past auction blocks where children were sold like furniture, their tiny wrists tied with rope. He watched as enslaved mothers worked in the shadow of mansions they would never enter, their backs bent and their eyes hollow. The city celebrated its elegance and prosperity, yet Denmark knew that its wealth rested on a mountain of bones. He could never unsee it. This dissonance gnawed at him. He had played by their rules and won, built a business, earned respect, carved out a life. But the system remained untouched, a machine grinding endlessly, swallowing black lives to fuel white fortunes. That realization hardened into something fierce. Survival was not enough. Freedom could not be personal, it had to be collective. If he could not buy the liberation of his people, he would have to orchestrate it. So Denmark began to plan, quietly, cautiously, like an entrepreneur laying the groundwork for a venture that could cost everything. He used the skills he had sharpened in business, discretion, persuasion, timing, and repurposed them for revolution. The African Methodist Episcopal Church became his cover, its prayer circles doubling as discreet strategy sessions. By candlelight, he and a handful of trusted men spoke in hushed tones about the unthinkable, striking against the entire system. He was methodical. He studied past uprisings in Haiti and elsewhere, learning not just from their victories but from their failures. He mapped the city in his mind, the guard rotations, the weak points in the armories, the patterns of the slave patrols. He understood that this would require more than fury. It would require precision, logistics, and discipline. The kind of discipline that entrepreneurs know, building something massive while pretending it doesn't exist until the moment it does. At first, his circle was small. Only those who had proven their loyalty and discretion were invited. He spoke to them not with fiery rhetoric but with cold logic, showing how the system could be dismantled if enough hands pushed at the same time. He promised them not riches, but dignity. Not safety, but purpose. And to men who had spent their lives treated as tools, that offer was intoxicating. The circle grew. Words spread quietly through whispers in the markets, nods exchanged in the fields, scraps of coded language passed between trusted friends. Denmark insisted on compartmentalization. No one knew the full plan except him, and those who recruited never revealed their own sources. It was the structure of a startup built in the shadows, a decentralized network of belief. By 1822, he had drawn in hundreds. Carpenters, blacksmiths, dockworkers, house servants. They came from every corner of Charleston's enslaved population. Many risked everything just to attend a secret gathering, slipping out under cover of night and returning before dawn as if nothing had happened. They pledged not just loyalty to Denmark, but loyalty to the idea he embodied, that they were not born to serve, but to stand. And through it all, Denmark moved with the same calm precision he had once used to measure wood for his furniture. He hid his rage behind a craftsman's steady hands, his ambition behind the polite smile expected of a free black man. Yet inside, the plan was no longer just an idea. It was becoming an inevitability, a force gathering momentum with each whispered vow. He knew the risk. Discovery meant death, not just for him but for everyone who believed in him. But Denmark Vesey had long ago made his peace with fear. He had outlived it. And now, as the seeds of rebellion took root in the cracks of Charleston's polished facade, he nurtured them with the patience of a man who understood exactly what it would take to make them bloom. As the walls of Charleston glimmered beneath the soft glow of gas lamps, Denmark Vesey walked its cobblestone streets with an expression as still as stone. To the casual observer, he was just another free black carpenter, respected for his craftsmanship and quiet dignity. But beneath that composed surface, his mind was an engine, turning, refining, orchestrating something far larger than himself. What had begun as whispers among a handful of trusted men was now blossoming into a vision so audacious it bordered on impossible. A city-wide revolt that could shatter the chains of slavery in one decisive stroke. Coordinating a city-wide uprising. Vesey understood that revolutions didn't happen by passion alone. They required precision. He approached planning like an architect sketching a cathedral, every detail measured, every part dependent on another. He divided Charleston into districts, assigning captains to each sector. They were men he trusted, fellow craftsmen, dock workers, and preachers who commanded respect within their communities. These captains would, in turn, recruit small cells of men, each cell unaware of the others to prevent leaks if anyone was captured or turned informant. The goal wasn't a riot. It was nothing short of strategic takeover. Vesey's blueprint envisioned simultaneous strikes across the city, arsenals seized, guardhouses overrun, key bridges blocked, and ships in the harbor captured for escape. He even calculated timing down to the hour, knowing when patrols were lightest, when the city's white elite would be most distracted, and when tides would favor a quick departure by sea if things went wrong. It wasn't reckless bravado. It was tactical genius rooted in cold, clear logic. Smuggling weapons and messages. Of course, grand strategy meant nothing without tools to carry it out. Weapons were the lifeblood of the plan, and acquiring them under constant surveillance required creativity. Vesey's followers smuggled blades and firearms in pieces, hidden inside barrels of rice and flour, tucked beneath false bottoms of carpenters' tool chests, or wrapped in bundles of firewood carried by delivery boys who seemed invisible to white eyes. Powder and shot were scavenged a few ounces at a time, bought secretly from sympathetic sailors or pilfered from careless militia stores. Equally vital were the lines of communication, which Vesey wove like a spider spinning silk. Because written notes could become nooses if discovered, he relied on memory and coded language. Messages passed as fragments of scripture during church gatherings, as psalm lyrics on the docks, as offhand comments during card games. No one courier carried the whole picture. Only Vesey held the master plan in his head. It was operational security before the term even existed, and it allowed the conspiracy to grow to hundreds without the city's powerful elite suspecting a thing. The date of revolution approaches. As the machinery of rebellion clicked into place, Vesey selected a date, a night that would be their lightning strike. It was to fall in late June, when summer heat thickened tempers and the city's guard grew lazy. The timing was no accident. Charleston would be flush with incoming merchant ships, meaning that once the uprising succeeded, captured vessels could ferry the freed men to Haiti, the Black Republic that had defied European empires and stood as a beacon of liberation. In those final days, Vesey carried himself with even greater calm, though inside him roared a storm. He knew the risk was astronomical. If discovered, it meant the noose. If they faltered, it meant mass slaughter. Yet he believed that living on one's knees was a slower death than dying on one's feet. He told his closest lieutenants, in words that burned into their minds, that the chance might never come again, that history rarely knocks twice. The air around them grew electric with quiet anticipation. Men who had spent their lives bending their backs for others began to stand straighter. They sharpened their tools not just for work but for war. They sang hymns in the fields with voices that carried new weight. Every glance, every handshake, carried secret meaning. The city continued its daily commerce, unaware that beneath its surface, an army was coiling in silence, ready to strike like thunder in the night. Vesey would walk home each evening past the Charleston harbor, gazing at the ships rocking gently on the tide. Those ships represented more than escape. They were symbols of transformation. Soon, he believed, the enslaved would no longer be cargo. They would be captains of their own destiny. And as the appointed night drew near, Denmark Vesey stood poised on the edge of history, his grand plan breathing like a living thing in the shadows, waiting only for the spark. The night that Denmark Vesey had spent years preparing for never came. It dissolved before it could ignite, like a storm that vanishes at the horizon. What destroyed it was not the strength of the oppressor, but the frailty of human fear, a fracture that formed inside the movement itself. Betrayal from within. In the final days before the planned uprising, tension crackled like dry timber ready to catch fire. Hundreds of men had sworn their loyalty, but silence is a hard burden to carry. Rumors slithered through the quarters, whispered anxieties about what would happen if they failed, what punishment would fall on their families, their children. And then came the first crack. A nervous recruit confided in someone outside the circle, perhaps hoping to ease his conscience, perhaps just seeking reassurance. That single confession metastasized. Within hours, Charleston's authorities had caught wind that something vast and terrifying was being plotted in the shadows. The city's white elite reacted with cold fury, not panic. They didn't lash out blindly, they hunted with surgical precision. Vesey never knew exactly who the first betrayer was, and maybe that was a mercy. But from that moment, the conspiracy that had grown like a living organism began to rot from the inside. Arrests and interrogations. The crackdown came swiftly, like a hammer in the night. Armed patrols flooded the streets. Known free black men were dragged from their beds, their homes overturned, their tools and papers seized as evidence of treason. Those suspected of even casual involvement were shackled and thrown into underground cells where the air stank of fear and damp stone. Interrogations were brutal. Some men resisted with iron silence, choosing pain over betrayal. Others cracked under the weight of terror, naming names to save their own lives, or at least to buy a little more time. The authorities played them against each other, staging confrontations between friends, spreading false confessions, weaving a net of paranoia so tight that no one could trust anyone. Vesey was finally arrested on June 22, 1822. They took him not as a wild-eyed rebel but as a composed, almost regal man who walked into custody with his head held high. To the men who hauled him away in chains, he looked more like a statesman than a criminal. Even in captivity, he refused to confess. He spoke little, and when he did, his words were measured, calm, almost defiant. He gave them nothing, not the satisfaction of fear, not the names of his followers, not the crumbling of his resolve. Trial, execution, and martyrdom. The trial that followed was a spectacle, carefully staged to reinforce the social order. Charleston's courtrooms became theaters of fear. The city's newspapers dripped with propaganda, painting Vesey as a monster, a would-be butcher of white families. Yet behind closed doors, even his enemies admitted he had been terrifyingly intelligent. The court produced coerced testimony and fabricated documents, but they could not disguise their deeper terror, that this man had nearly pulled off one of the largest slave uprisings in American history. On July 2, 1822, Denmark Vesey was sentenced to death. As the judge read the words, Vesey stood motionless, his gaze steady and distant, as though he were already looking beyond this world. When he spoke his final words, they were not for himself but for the generations to come. He declared that the thirst for freedom could not be extinguished by ropes or gallows, that liberty was not granted by law but claimed by courage. They hanged him in the cool morning hours. The rope snapped taut, and Charleston exhaled in relief, but also in unease. Because even in death, Vesey's presence refused to vanish. He had not died screaming or begging. He had died like a soldier, eyes open, shoulders squared, unbroken. The authorities buried his body in an unmarked grave, hoping to erase him from memory. But ideas are harder to bury than flesh. Among Charleston's black community, Vesey became more than a man. He became a story, a symbol, a whispered reminder that freedom could be imagined even when it seemed impossible. For the city's white elite, the memory of him lingered like the echo of thunder after lightning. And for generations of black Americans, his name traveled quietly through time like an ember carried in cupped hands, waiting for the right moment, the right spark, to blaze again. Denmark Vesey's revolt failed. But his refusal to submit became something larger than victory. It became proof that one person, armed only with vision and will, could make an entire empire tremble. Centuries have passed since the rope tightened around Denmark Vesey's neck, yet his spirit still walks the streets of Charleston, invisible but undeniable. The city that once silenced his name now bears monuments in his honor. Schools teach his defiance. Churches whisper his courage in their hymns. Vesey may not have lived to see freedom, but the seeds he planted cracked the stone of history long after he was gone. His story is more than an echo from a distant century. It is a living reminder that real change often begins as an idea in the mind of one determined soul. He risked everything not for personal gain but to awaken the possibility of liberty in those who had forgotten how to dream. Entrepreneurs, creators, and visionaries know that same fire, the belief that the impossible can be reshaped by sheer will. Denmark Vesey's courage asks something of us, not to accept the world as it is, but to dare to imagine what it could become. His rebellion failed, but his legacy endures because he refused to die small. If this story moved you, carry it forward. Share it with someone who values courage. And if you want more untold stories of forgotten heroes who shaped our world, subscribe to this channel. Your support keeps these voices alive and ensures their light will never be buried in the dark again.